Okay, for the sake of time, we will not recap because we got abruptly cut off as we're recording. So basically, in this part of the clip, we're basically dealing with invoices as to seeing the validity of an invoice and as to what type of an invoice we're dealing with. There are, in most common cases, there are two common invoices that we should likely be looking out for. So over here on the left, what I've tried to do is that I've tried to give you descriptions of all the particulars that should be entailed within a particular type of an invoice. The first part is I've basically given these descriptions. I've jotted down descriptions, and within these descriptions I've basically categorized descriptions from category A to right up to the category H. Basic description, so from A right up to H categories. And these descriptions go as something like this: title, supplier name, address, VAT registration number, recipient's name, the same as the above information, sequence number, date, description of goods, services, quantity of goods, services, value or supply. That's basically what we did on the left in terms of these descriptions ranging from category A to H. Over on the side, which is where I'll tip the camera a bit, I basically have dotted down now what I've basically titled a full VAT invoice and an abridged VAT invoice. So these are the two common invoices that we likely get in practice. Of course, there are other invoices which will basically just make you aware of. It's not too much of an issue. Alright, in terms of a full VAT invoice, the uniqueness of a full VAT invoice is that the invoice itself needs to be in excess of an amount of 5,000 rands or equals to 5,000 rands. That would likely reflect that invoice as being your full VAT invoice. Whereas with your abridged VAT invoice is anything which is less than 5,000 rands or below 5,000 rands, right down to 50 rands. That would likely reflect that invoice to be an abridged VAT invoice. So there are particular characteristics that you should be looking out for in terms of an invoice being a full VAT invoice or being an abridged VAT invoice. Anything which is below 50 rands would likely be reflected in the form of a tail slip that you'd likely get from Pick and Pay as you're buying whatever, or from a particular VAT vendor for an amount which is less than 50 rands. Right, so in terms of the categories that we've basically categorized on the left hand side, we've basically touched on those descriptions. So what kind of descriptions would be reflected within a full VAT invoice? You'd likely be expected to have descriptions from A to H. What are we talking about? In terms of description A, which is titled, we are basically wanting to know as to your invoice needs to have a title. Well, is it an invoice? Is it a VAT invoice? Is it a tax invoice? Or, something needs to give us an idea that we've got an invoice. So that needs to be apparent in both your full VAT invoice and also in your abridged VAT invoice. These two characteristics are common to the two. The second part that we speak about is VAT invoice B, which is supplier name, address, and VAT registration number. So B will also be reflected in your full VAT invoice, and the same will be said about your abridged. So all of these must also have, supplier address and VAT registration number within the actual invoice. C is only required for your category for your full VAT invoice, whereas for your abridged on this side, we do not require to see the recipient's address and so forth. I hope you get the gist of what we're trying to do here. D is basically talking about the sequence number to see the uniqueness of the invoice as to whether it's now invoice number 2, 3, and 4, so that it can be properly recorded, it can be traced back if they so wish to be tracing. That needs to be done. There was like a wrong order, whatever the case would be, or goods and services were not delivered as per the invoice itself. So that would be a critical component of the invoice, which is D, and it will also have to appear within your abridged as well. And E pertains to date. So we need both date for E, for full, and for abridged. We need date. Description of goods and services, this is a very important part as well. We need to know if we're buying, what kind of goods, services we're getting. So that should be reflected within your full and also within your abridged. The quantity or the volume of goods or services that are being supplied. This only has to be featured in your full. For an abridged, it's not so important, so we don't really require it. After all, the invoice is less than 5,000 rands. And H is the value of supply. How much is it? How much tax are we being charged? All those details need to be there. So that is a very critical part of the invoice itself. So that should be applying for basically both these invoices. So these are the basic descriptions that you should be looking out for. So I can likely say, just to make this a lot more easier, in saying that your full VAT invoice, your abridged VAT invoice, they're basically the same, except for just two parts. The one part that talks about the supply, the recipient's details, address, and VAT registration number. We don't really require that detail so much for an abridged. And the other part is that we don't need to know the volume or the quantity of services or goods being provided. And that's basically what you should be looking for in terms of the validity of an invoice. And again, if you have an invoice which is not a valid VAT invoice, that invoice would therefore not be able to claim back or to process any VAT transactions, because it would not be in compliance as per the SAR standards, and that can likely land you in hot water. There could be some obviously litigation situations that could even arise depending on the size of the invoice, the size of the actual matter, and all of that. So be very careful when looking at an invoice. So even in a test situation, an examiner can give you an invalid VAT invoice, and they would likely ask you to do certain things on the invoice, whereas if you were to do that, you'd likely be just wasting your time and you'd be missing the actual point that the examiner was likely testing. So be very cautious and careful of valid VAT invoices. We won't go into too much detail about that from that basic description now, because at this point you're expected to know what a valid VAT invoice is or not.